last decade, a silent transformation has been taking place on the streets of America. Buildings that for generations served as spiritual pillars of entire communities now display for sale signs or remain abandoned, with broken stained glass windows and crumbling towers. We are talking about American churches, and what is happening to them is one of the most surprising and under-discussed phenomena of urban transformation in the United States. Every week, between 6,000 and 10,000 churches permanently close their doors in the United States. That's right, you didn't misread. 6,000 to 10,000 per week. We are talking about an unprecedented spiritual exodus in American history, a nation that has always prided itself on its religious identity. To put this into perspective, this means that approximately 15 churches close their doors every hour in the country. The pace is so fast that many communities can barely process what is happening before the next temple is put up for sale. The causes of this collapse are multiple and complex. The first and most obvious is demographic. Younger generations simply aren't attending church like their parents and grandparents did. Research from the Pew Research Center shows that the share of Americans who identify as non-religious has tripled since the 1990s, jumping from 8% to more than 25% of the population. Among millennials and Generation Z, that number is even more dramatic, reaching close to 40%. This means that the base of faithful who sustained these institutions is literally disappearing. But it's not just a matter of faith. It's also a matter of money. Keeping a church running is incredibly expensive. Many of these buildings were built a century or more ago, in times of prosperity and population growth. They were designed for congregations of 500, 1,000, sometimes 2,000 people. Today, many of these same churches struggle to gather 50 faithful on a Sunday. The maintenance costs, however, remain the same. Leaky roofs, old heating systems, cracking foundations, historic stained glass windows that cost fortunes to restore. A single church can easily spend $50,000 to $200,000 a year on basic maintenance alone. COVID only accelerated a trend that had already been underway for decades. During lockdowns, many older worshipers simply stopped going to church and never returned, some out of fear of contagion, others because they discovered they didn't miss it that much. Online broadcasts, which were supposed to be a temporary solution, became permanent for many. Why leave the house on a cold Sunday when you can watch the service in your pajamas while drinking coffee? Donations plummeted. Congregations that were already fragile before the pandemic simply did not survive. Geographically, the phenomenon is not uniform. The Rust Belt and the Northeast are being particularly hard hit. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Pittsburgh have hundreds of abandoned churches. These are regions that have already lost population for decades due to industrial decline. Churches that served factory workers now have no more worshipers because the factories closed and the people left. In some Detroit neighborhoods, you can find 3 or 4 abandoned churches within a few blocks. Magnificent buildings, sometimes architectural masterpieces from the early 20th century, now covered in graffiti and overrun by pigeons. In the South, traditionally known as the Bible Belt, the situation is somewhat different but equally worrying. There, it is not so much the large historic churches that are closing, but rather hundreds of small rural churches. Farming communities that had their own Baptist, Methodist, or Pentecostal churches are disappearing as young people migrate to the cities. These small wooden churches, which were the social heart of villages for generations, now stand empty and dilapidated on rural roads in Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Tennessee. Some have only 10 or 15 members remaining, all elderly, unable to maintain the building or pay a pastor. What happens to these buildings when they close is a fascinating story in itself. Some have happy endings, being converted to uses that still serve the community. Others become disturbing symbols of urban decline. And some generate intense controversy about what is appropriate to do with a space that was once considered sacred. The most popular conversions are into luxury residences. In cities like Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh, churches are being transformed into spectacular lofts that sell for millions of dollars. Imagine living in a space with 15-meter-high ceilings, original stained glass windows filtering colored light into your living room, and historic pipe organs as decorative pieces. Architects love these projects because the open layout and dramatic elements create truly unique residences. One converted church in Brooklyn sold for $8 million. Another in San Francisco was transformed into a 3-story mansion with a gym, wine cellar, and private cinema. But for every glamorous conversion, there are dozens that take more controversial paths. Craft bars and breweries have become popular tenants of former churches. The irony doesn't go unnoticed by anyone. A place where alcohol was once considered a sin now serves IPAs and cocktails under the same vaulted ceilings. In Portland, a 1872 Methodist church has become one of the city's most popular breweries, retaining the original pews as seating. In Pittsburgh, a Catholic church has become a nightclub hosting electronic music parties where morning masses once were held. Even more controversial are the conversions into adult entertainment venues. Several churches have been transformed into strip clubs, burlesque houses, or themed bars. Religious communities frequently protest these conversions, arguing that they desecrate sacred places. But legally, once the building is sold, the new owner has the right to make virtually any commercial use permitted by zoning. In Detroit, a former Baptist church now operates as an LGBTQ nightclub, something that would have been unthinkable when the building was constructed in 1920. Gyms and yoga studios are also common destinations. New York City's Equinox Gym is located in a converted church in the Flatiron District. Members do spinning where worshipers once prayed. CrossFit boxes, indoor climbing studios, and martial arts centers have all discovered that churches offer the perfect high open spaces for their activities. A church in Denver was converted into an indoor trampoline center where children jump where an altar once stood. But perhaps the most interesting conversions are those that retain some element of community service. Libraries, community centers, theaters, local museums, co-working spaces, and even charter schools have found new homes in former churches. These conversions are generally more accepted by communities because they still serve a positive public purpose. A Methodist church in Seattle became a non-profit theater performance space. Another in Philadelphia became a resource center for immigrants and refugees. These uses at least echo the original mission of community service. Unfortunately, many churches simply can't find buyers at all. Religious buildings are notoriously difficult to sell. They are enormous, expensive to maintain, and often have strange layouts that don't easily adapt to new uses. Furthermore, many are located in neighborhoods that have already lost economic vitality, where there is simply no demand for large commercial or residential spaces. The result is hundreds, perhaps thousands of churches that sit empty and deteriorate for years. These abandoned churches become magnets for vandalism, drug use, and homeless people seeking shelter. Windows are broken, copper is stolen to be sold as scrap metal, roofs begin to leak, allowing rain to damage the interior. Once deterioration begins, it accelerates rapidly. In just a few years, a building that has served a community for a century can become a dangerous ruin. Cities then face the costly dilemma of having to demolish structures that are often protected historical landmarks. From an investment and opportunity standpoint, the mass closure of churches presents fascinating scenarios for both investors and creative entrepreneurs. But navigating this market requires sensitivity, vision, and a deep understanding of local dynamics. For real estate investors, churches can represent extraordinary opportunities to buy substantial assets for fractions of their replacement value. A church that would cost $10 million to build today can be bought for $500,000 or less. The trick is to identify which properties are in markets with appreciation potential and which are in areas of terminal decline. A church in a gentrifying neighborhood in Brooklyn or Portland can be a goldmine. The same church in a dying industrial town in rural Pennsylvania can be a financial black hole. Conversion costs are the critical factor. Transforming a church into usable residential or commercial spaces is not cheap. You are working with buildings that often lack adequate insulation, modern electrical and plumbing systems, or layouts that make sense for contemporary use. Conversion budgets can easily range from $1 to $5 million depending on size and condition. Smart investors look for churches that already have some basic infrastructure or are in solid structural condition to minimize these costs. There is also the issue of historical heritage restrictions. Many churches, especially those built before 1950, are on local or national historical registers. This can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, there may be significant tax incentives available for the restoration of historic buildings, credits that can cover up to 20 or 30% of renovation costs. On the other hand, the restrictions on what you can change are stringent. You may have to retain original architectural elements, use period-specific materials, or obtain approval from preservation commissions for every change, a process that can add months or years to the project timeline. For entrepreneurs, churches offer unique opportunities to create truly memorable businesses. Restaurants and breweries in converted churches often become destinations due to their architectural uniqueness. The dramatic setting creates an experience that simply cannot be replicated in a conventional commercial space. Weddings and private events are another lucrative market. Many couples love the idea of getting married in a deconsecrated church that has been transformed into an event space, obtaining the traditional religious aesthetic without necessarily the religious context. Co-working spaces and creative offices have also found a natural home in converted churches. Tech startups, advertising agencies, and media companies appreciate the tall open spaces and the cachet of working in a unique historic building. A converted church in Chicago now houses over 50 startups in an incubator environment. The individual offices were built keeping all the original architectural elements visible, creating a fascinating contrast between old and new. But perhaps the biggest opportunity is in affordable housing. With the housing crisis hitting cities across the country, some nonprofits and socially conscious developers are buying churches and converting them into affordable rental apartments or even supportive housing for vulnerable populations. One church in Los Angeles was converted into 50 housing units for homeless veterans. Another one in Boston has been converted into apartments for low-income seniors. These projects often gain access to government subsidies and philanthropic funds that make the economy viable even with low rents. There are also opportunities in simply acquiring and holding. Some churches in markets that have not yet recovered can be bought for absurdly low prices, $20,000, $30,000, $50,000. For investors with a long-term horizon and capital for minimal maintenance, it may make sense to buy and hold, hoping that the neighborhood will eventually revitalize. It is speculative, certainly, but the potential return can be enormous if you choose correctly. The mass closure of American churches is more than just a story about religious decline. It is a story about urban transformation, demographic change, and the creative ways societies find to reuse their built heritage. For every church that becomes a sad ruin, another transforms into something vibrant and new. It is a reminder that cities are living organisms, constantly adapting and reinventing themselves. Buildings may change purpose, but they continue to serve communities in ways their original builders could never have imagined. The question now is what will become of the thousands of churches that remain, awaiting their next chapter.